March 1945, West Texas. 23 German women stepped off military trucks expecting to be shot. Instead, American guards handed them plates of bacon and eggs. 3 of the women broke down crying at the table. Within 4 months, 7 would be writing marriage proposals to their captors. This is the untold story of Fort Stockton, POW camp, where the wire separated enemies, but breakfast united hearts. The trucks rattled to a stop in clouds of desert dust. The sound of engines faded into the vast silence of West Texas. Only the wind remained, carrying the scent of mesquite smoke across endless miles of nothing. 23 pairs of eyes stared through the canvas at a landscape that looked like the surface of another planet. No trees, no buildings on the horizon, just sand and sky and heat, shimmering in waves that made the barbed wire fence look like it was breathing. But the bacon breakfast was only the beginning. What happened when one guard offered a horse to a German prisoner would change international relations forever. We will get to that moment in a bit. First, you need to understand how these women ended up in the Texas desert in the first place. Greta Weber sat with her back pressed against the wooden bench, hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone white. 24 years old, dark hair pulled back in a regulation bun, though loose strands had escaped during the 3-day journey from New York. Gray eyes that had once sparkled with the dreams of a Berlin hospital nurse now carried the flat emptiness of someone who had watched her world burn. Literally burn. The smell of smoke still lived in her memory, in her hair, in her nightmares. Her fingers found the silver locket at her throat. Inside a photo of her sister Anna, 16 years old in the picture. Forever 16 now. The Allied bombs had made sure of that. February 14th, Valentine's Day. The irony wasn't lost on Greta. A day for love had given her only ash and absence. The truck lurched forward again. Through the gap in the canvas, she caught her first glimpse of the camp. Wooden barracks arranged in neat rows, guard towers at each corner, American flags snapping in the desert wind so bright against the pale sky it hurt to look at. And there at the gate, the men who had conquered the Wehrmacht. They looked like boys playing dress-up. One of them was chewing gum, actually chewing gum jaw, working slowly as he leaned against his rifle like it was a broom handle. Another had his helmet pushed so far back on his head, it looked ready to fall off. A third was reading something, a thin magazine with colorful pictures. Comic books. The conquerors of Europe were reading comic books. Elsa Schneider, sitting beside Greta, let out a sound halfway between a laugh and a sob. 28 years old, red hairs that had once been carefully styled now hanging limp and unwashed. Former secretary at Wehrmacht headquarters in Berlin. She had typed orders that sent men to die. Now she was property of men who looked too young to shave properly. These Anarin, Elsa whispered. These fools. These are the men who defeated us. The truck stopped. The tailgate dropped with a metallic clang that echoed across the compound. Boots crunched on gravel. An American voice, young and uncertain, called out something in English none of them fully understood. The tone was clear enough, though. Get out, line up, move. Greta climbed down, legs stiff from 3 days of sitting. Her feet hit Texas soil for the first time. The ground felt solid, real, more real than anything had felt since the bombs fell. She stood with the others, trying to maintain the rigid posture drilled into her by years of German discipline. Back straight, eyes forward. Show no weakness. The guards walked along the line, checking names against clipboards. One of them stopped in front of Greta. She forced herself to look up to meet the eyes of the enemy. Freckles. That was her first thought. He had freckles scattered across his nose like paint flecks. Blue eyes, the color of a sky she half remembered from childhood before the war, made everything gray. Sandy blonde hair that caught the sunlight. He looked like he belonged on a farm, not in a military uniform. 22, maybe 23 years old, tall, broad-shouldered in the way of men who had grown up doing real work, not just military drills. He was looking at her, not through her, not past her, but at her, seeing her as a person, not a prisoner number. The clipboard in his hand seemed almost forgotten. Name, ma'am? His voice was soft, polite. Ma'am, he called her ma'am. Greta Weber. Her English was broken accent thick enough to cut. Nurse, Berlin. He wrote something down, then he did something that made her breath catch. He smiled. Not a cruel smile, not a mocking smile. Just a small, gentle curve of his lips. that reached his eyes and made them crinkle at the corners. "Welcome to Fort Stockton, Miss Weber. I hope, I hope you find some peace here." Then he moved on to the next woman, leaving Greta standing there with her heart doing something strange and unwelcome in her chest. Greta had no idea that the freckled guard, blowing gum bubbles, would teach her to ride horses within 3 months, or that his grandmother's cornbread recipe would become her favorite meal for the next 40 years. The women were marched to their barracks, long wooden building that smelled of fresh sawdust and lye soap, rows of bunks, thin mattresses, wool blankets that looked new. Through the small windows, they could see more of the camp, guards walking patrol routes, American flags everywhere, and beyond the wire, nothing but desert stretching to a horizon so far away it made the heart ache. That night, Greta lay on her bunk and touched the locket again, opened it, stared at Anna's face in the dim light, her little sister who had wanted to be a teacher, who had loved music and poetry and boys with dark eyes, who had died in rubble while Greta was working a hospital shift 10 blocks away. "Ich werde sie niemals vergessen," she whispered to the darkness. "I will never forget them." Then softer the words that felt like betrayal even as she spoke them. "Und ich werde niemals den Amerikanern vergeben." And I will never forgive the Americans. That locket would stay around Greta's neck for 3 months. Then one day an American guard would ask about it, and her answer would shock even herself. Over the next 45 minutes, you are going to witness one of the most remarkable transformations in American military history. You will see how a plate of bacon changed international diplomacy, how a cowboy's kindness prevented a Cold War incident, and how barbed wire designed to separate ended up uniting families across 2 continents for generations. This is not a story about war. War was already over, or nearly so. This is a story about what comes after, about young people trying to be human in a place designed to keep them apart, about the moment when an enemy stops being an enemy and becomes simply another person trying to survive. By March 1945, the war in Europe was nearly over. Germany was collapsing from both sides, Soviet tanks rolling in from the East American and British forces pushing from the West. The Allies had over 400,000 German POWs in camps across America, most of them in Texas, where wide-open ranch land made escape nearly impossible, and local farmers needed workers to replace the American boys fighting overseas. Fort Stockton had been established in 1943. Capacity 500 prisoners, mostly men, until March of 45. Then 23 female auxiliaries were transferred from an East Coast processing center. Nurses, clerks, radio operators, women who had served the Wehrmacht in non-combat roles. They were separated from the male POWs for their own safety and sent to this isolated camp 40 miles from the nearest town, surrounded by the Chihuahuan Desert on all sides. The camp commander was Colonel Robert Hayes, 45 years old, West Point graduate class of 1923. He had fought in France during the First World War, spent months in trenches watching men die for yards of mud. The experience had marked him carved lines into his face that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with witnessing what human beings could do to each other when nations went mad. He stood now in his office looking out the window at the new arrivals being processed. Texan by birth, raised in Fredericksburg on a cattle ranch that his grandfather had carved out of raw land with nothing but determination and a good horse. The war had taken him away from that land, but it had never left his blood. He understood hard work, he understood dignity, and he understood that how America treated its defeated enemies would matter more than how it had defeated them in the first place. "The war is won," he had told his men the day before the women arrived, "when we show them what American values really mean." He was a strict adherent to the Geneva Convention. Proper food, proper shelter, proper medical care. No abuse, physical or verbal. These were human beings under his protection, not cattle to be managed. That philosophy had earned him some criticism from superiors who thought he was too soft, but Hayes did not care. He had seen what happened when men forgot that their enemies were human. He had no intention of becoming the thing he had fought against. Colonel Hayes had a secret reason for treating POWs so well, a reason rooted in his own First World War experience. When that reason came to light months later, even his own men would be moved to tears. One of those men was Corporal James Morrison. Everyone called him Jimmy. 22 years old, born and raised in Fredericksburg, Texas, in the heart of the hill country, where German immigrants had settled generations before. His own great-grandfather had come from Bavaria in the 1840s, built a ranch with his bare hands, married a local girl, and raised sons who spoke German at home and English everywhere else. Jimmy was fourth generation on that ranch. 2,000 acres of cattle, land, good water, better grass. He had been drafted in 1943 at age 20. Made it through basic training until a broken leg during an obstacle course exercise earned him a medical discharge from combat duty. They kept him stateside, assigned him to guard duty at various camps. He felt guilty about it. All his high school friends were overseas, landing on beaches, fighting through forests. And here he was checking clipboards and walking fence lines in Texas. But he followed orders. That was what you did. And he tried to do his job well, even if it was not the job he had wanted. He was 6'1", sandy blonde hair that would not stay neat no matter how much pomade he used, freckles across his nose that made him look younger than he was. Farm strong, the kind of muscle that came from real work, not gymnasium exercises. Blue eyes that his mother said came from his German great-grandfather. Polite to a fault, raised on yes ma'am and no sir, and the belief that every person deserved basic respect until they proved otherwise. He had been writing letters to a girl back in Fredericksburg for 2 years, Sarah Klein. Pretty girl, blonde hair, worked at her father's general store. They had an understanding, or so he thought. Marriage eventually, ranch life. Kids running through the same fields where he had run as a boy. Jimmy had been writing letters to a girl back in Fredericksburg for 2 years. In 6 weeks, he would stop writing her entirely. The reason would surprise his whole family. Morning came with the clang of the camp bell. The German women lined up for roll call, still trying to maintain their military bearing. Some of them whispered jokes to each other in German, pointing at the guards with poorly hidden smirks. Look at that one with his helmet falling off. Look at how they slouch. The Wehrmacht would never tolerate such disorder. But underneath the mockery was confusion. Why were these sloppy soldiers not angry about being mocked? Why did they not strike back, assert dominance, show their power? One guard actually laughed when he overheard the women making fun of his mismatched boots. Laughed and said something in English that made his fellow guards chuckle. No anger, no punishment, just acceptance of the absurdity. For women trained to expect cruelty from enemies, this gentle indifference was more unsettling than any violence could have been. After roll call came breakfast. The women were marched to the mess hall, a long wooden building with windows that let in the bright morning sun. The smell hit them before they entered. Rich, overwhelming, impossible. Bacon, coffee, fresh bread. Smells they had not experienced in years, since before the war had strangled Germany's food supply, down to turnips and sawdust bread. Greta walked through the door and stopped. The mess hall was full of American guards already eating, talking loudly, laughing over some joke. The sound was so casual, so normal, so alive. Like men at peace, not men at war. The serving line was manned by an older black soldier, stripes on his sleeve indicating corporal rank. He had kind eyes and hands that moved with practiced efficiency as he filled plates. When Greta reached him, he smiled. "Morning, miss. Hope you're hungry." And the plate he handed her held 3 strips of bacon, still glistening with fat. 2 fried eggs, yolks perfect yellow whites cooked just right. 2 slices of white bread with butter already melting into golden pools. A tin cup of coffee, real coffee with cream swirling in dark clouds. Greta stared at the plate. Her hands began to shake. The last real meal she had eaten was watery turnip soup 3 days ago. For that, rotten potatoes that had made her stomach cramp. In Berlin, rationing had been brutal for years. 500 calories a day if you were lucky. Sawdust mixed into bread to make it go further. Meat only as a distant memory of better times. And now this abundance. This impossible, overwhelming generosity from the enemy. Greta did not know it yet, but Corporal Moses Washington had a personal reason for making that breakfast so perfect. His story would intersect with hers in an unexpected way 3 months later at a wedding she never imagined she would attend. She found a seat at the far end of a table. Elsa sat beside her, staring at her own plate with wide eyes. Around them, other German women were having the same reaction. Shock, disbelief, and underneath it all, hunger so fierce it hurt. Greta picked up a strip of bacon. The grease coated her fingers. She brought it to her mouth, hesitated, then bit down. The taste exploded across her tongue. salt, fat, smoke rich and deep from mesquite wood. The texture was perfect, crispy on the edges, still chewy in the center. Warmth spread through her empty stomach like a fire catching dry wood. Tears started forming in her eyes. She tried to hide them, tried to make a face of disgust. Said in German to Elsa, Amerikanisches Schweinefutter, American pig food. But her hands betrayed her. She could not stop eating. She devoured the entire plate in 4 minutes, soaking up every drop of egg yolk with the bread, drinking the coffee so fast it burned her tongue. When the plate was empty, she wanted to cry, wanted to ask for more, wanted to hate herself for wanting more from the people who had destroyed her city. Across the mess hall, Jimmy Morrison watched. He saw through the act, saw her genuine hunger, saw the tears she was trying to hide. He did not mock her, did not make a comment, just watched with those blue eyes, gentle and knowing. Greta caught him watching. She looked away quickly, cheeks burning red, heart beating faster. She noticed that her heart was beating faster, and that confused her, made her angry. Why should an enemy guard's attention make her feel anything at all? That moment, Greta's first bite of bacon and Jimmy's quiet observation was the beginning. But neither of them understood what was starting. Not yet. The day continued with work assignments. The women were divided into groups. Some went to the laundry, some to the kitchen for dish duty, others to general camp maintenance, sweeping barracks, cleaning windows. Greta was assigned to laundry detail. She stood at a large wooden tub, scrubbing uniforms in hot water that made her hands red and raw. The work was hard but not unfamiliar. She had scrubbed hospital linens during the war. This was easier, actually. No blood, no smell of infection and death. Anna Klein worked beside her. 26 years old, Shai had been a clerk in Munich before being drafted into service. She had lost her husband on the Eastern Front in 1943. Since then, she had moved through life like a ghost, doing what she was told, feeling nothing. Anna was struggling with a bucket of rinse water, 40 pounds of sloshing weight handle cutting into her palms. Her arms shook. The bucket tilted dangerously. She expected the American guards to yell at her if she spilled it, expected punishment for weakness. Instead, Private Tom Anderson walked over. 25 years old, had been a police officer in Houston before the draft. He was tall, broad, with a skeptical face that suggested he did not trust much in this world. But he saw Anna struggling, and something in him responded to that struggle in a way that surprised even himself. He did not order her to work harder, did not mock her weakness. He simply reached down, took hold of the other handle, and lifted. Together, they carried the bucket to the wash station. Wordlessly, he set it down, nodded once, and walked away. No demand for gratitude. No expectation of anything in return. Anna stood frozen, staring at his retreating back. In Wehrmacht camps, officers never helped enlisted personnel. In her entire experience of military life, men with rank commanded, they did not assist. This simple act of help without expectation was completely foreign to everything she understood about soldiers and power. The other women witnessed this. They exchanged glances, whispered in German. Elsa said, "Das ist eine Falle." This is a trap. Frieda Braun, the oldest of them, at 31, a head nurse who carried herself with maternal authority, said softly, "Oder, vielleicht nicht," or maybe not. Greta saw the whole thing. She tried to make sense of it. Why would he help? What did he want? Soldiers did not help prisoners out of kindness. There had to be an angle, a manipulation, something. But she could not figure out what it was. And that bothered her more than she wanted to admit. To understand why this simple act shocked these women so deeply, you have to understand what they had been taught about Americans and about the role of soldiers in their society. German military culture was built on rigid hierarchy, obedience through fear. Orders were absolute. Rank was everything. The very idea of a superior helping an inferior with manual labor was not just unusual, it was unthinkable. And the Nazi propaganda about Americans had painted them as undisciplined, weak, greedy barbarians who fought without honor and won only through numerical superiority and industrial might. The women had been told that American soldiers were cruel to prisoners, that they respected nothing, that they would use any advantage to humiliate the defeated. But the evidence before their eyes contradicted every single piece of propaganda. These Americans were casual, yes, Undisciplined in the Prussian sense, absolutely, but cruel. The opposite seemed to be true, and that cognitive dissonance was harder to process than any punishment would have been. Evening came. The Texas sun sank toward the horizon, painting the sky in colors that seemed too beautiful for a prison camp. Orange and pink and purple layers that made the barbed wire look almost decorative. The women returned to their barracks exhausted from work bellies, full for the first time in recent memory. They lay on their bunks as darkness fell. Through the windows they could see guards finishing their shifts. A small fire burned in an oil drum. Men gathered around it, voices carrying on the desert breeze. Then came the sound, a harmonica. Slow, mournful, beautiful. The melody was unfamiliar, but the emotion behind it was universal. Longing, homesickness, the ache of being far from where you belong. Private Danny Hayes played that harmonica. 20 years old, the colonel's nephew, raised in Houston, but spending summers on his uncle's ranch in Fredericksburg. He played the way some men prayed, pouring everything he could not say into the music. The sound drifted through the barracks like water finding cracks. The women fell silent. Some closed their eyes. Elsa's face softened in a way it had not since Berlin. Anna's lip trembled. Frida wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand. Music bypassed language, bypassed propaganda, bypassed everything that separated human beings and spoke directly to the part of the soul that just wanted to go home. Greta clutched her sister's locket and listened. The melody reminded her of better times. Her father playing piano in their apartment before the war. Anna singing off-key while doing dishes. Christmas concerts at the church near their neighborhood. All of it gone now. Ash and memory. A thought came unbidden, unwelcome. The enemy should not sound beautiful. But he did. The harmonica sang and it was beautiful, and Greta hated that it made her feel something other than rage. That harmonica would become the soundtrack to their transformation. But it would also cause the first major conflict between the women and the guards, a conflict that would erupt in just 2 weeks. The women whispered to each other in the darkness. Some still mocked the guards, calling them overgrown boys, saying they were unfit to be real soldiers. But the mockery rang hollow now. Everyone could hear it. The sharp edge of ridicule had been replaced by something softer, more confused. Why were they being treated well? What was the purpose? Where was the punishment they had been promised? Elsa spoke into the darkness. Did you see how they laughed when one dropped his rifle? In the Wehrmacht, that would mean punishment. Anna's voice small and uncertain. The one who helped me with the bucket. He did not ask for anything. Frida maternal and thoughtful. The food is real, not propaganda, real eggs, real meat, real coffee. Greta said nothing. She was thinking about the bacon breakfast, about Jimmy's eyes watching her across the mess hall, about the bucket assistants, about the complete absence of cruelty in every interaction. Her propaganda training said one thing. The evidence of her senses said something completely different. And in that gap between expectation and reality, something dangerous was growing. Curiosity. That night, Greta pulled out a small notebook she had hidden in her belongings, a journal she had kept since Berlin, writing down her thoughts in tiny, cramped handwriting. She wrote by the faint light from the window words in German that she would never dare speak aloud. They are not what I expected. The Americans. They are casual, yes, undisciplined by our standards. But they are not cruel. Today I ate more food than I have eaten in 6 months. A guard smiled at me and called me ma'am. Another helped Anna without being asked. I do not understand. If they are barbarians, why do they treat us with such care? If we are enemies, why do they feed us so well? Nothing makes sense anymore. I do not know who to hate. I do not know what to believe. That journal would be discovered weeks later, and it would cause a crisis that threatened everything. But Greta did not know that as she tucked the notebook back into its hiding place and laid down on her bunk, staring at the ceiling in the darkness. Outside, the harmonica played on. The melody shifted to something even more melancholy. Danny Hayes was thinking about a girl back in Houston, wondering if she was thinking about him. He did not know that in 3 weeks, he would stop thinking about that girl entirely. His attention would be captured by a shy German clerk with sad eyes who reminded him of someone worth protecting. The laughter the women had used as armor was beginning to crack. Underneath, something more dangerous was stirring. Curiosity, questions, the terrible possibility that everything they had been taught about the enemy might be wrong. And curiosity in a place designed to separate enemies was the first step towards something none of them could have predicted. Greta fell asleep with the sound of the harmonica in her ears and the taste of bacon still ghosting across her tongue. She dreamed of her sister. Anna was alive in the dream, laughing whole. They were walking through Berlin on a spring day before the war. The sun was shining. Everything was possible. Then the dream shifted. Anna was pointing at something. Greta turned to look. It was the freckled guard with the blue eyes. He was holding out a wildflower yellow petals bright against the gray rubble of Berlin. He was saying something Greta could not quite hear. She woke before dawn, heart pounding, disturbed by a dream she did not want to examine too closely. Through the window, the Texas sky was beginning to lighten. Another day in captivity, another day of trying to hate people who insisted on being kind. The morning bell would ring soon. There would be more bacon, more coffee, more small kindnesses that chipped away at the armor around her heart. And across the compound, Jimmy Morrison would be waking up thinking about the German nurse with gray eyes who had looked so lost when she bit into that first piece of bacon. Neither of them knew what was coming. The wildflowers, the proposals, the weddings that would scandalize an entire state, the families that would span 2 continents, the proof that barbed wire could separate bodies but not souls determined to connect. All of that was still ahead. For now, there was just the dawn, just the desert, just 2 people who had been taught to be enemies, slowly, carefully beginning to wonder if maybe, just maybe, there was another way to be. 2 weeks passed at Fort Stockton. 14 days of Texas heat and unexpected kindness. 14 mornings of bacon and coffee. 14 evenings of harmonica music drifting through barbed wire. The women were settling into routines, learning the rhythm of camp life. But underneath the surface, something was shifting. Something dangerous and undeniable. Colonel Hayes instituted English classes for the prisoners. The practical reason was communication. Better English meant fewer misunderstandings, smoother camp operations. But Hayes had another motive, one he did not speak aloud. Language was the first bridge between enemies. Once people could talk to each other, truly talk, it became harder to maintain the walls that propaganda had built. The classes were held in the rec room after dinner 3 evenings a week. Guards were assigned as teachers, one-on-one pairings that would give both sides a chance to see each other as individuals rather than uniforms and labels. Jimmy Morrison was assigned to teach Greta Weber. He arrived early that first evening, nervous in a way that had nothing to do with teaching. He had never been good at school himself, barely graduating high school before the ranch claimed all his time and attention. What did he know about teaching someone a language? But orders were orders, and Greta needed to learn, so he would do his best. She arrived exactly on time, back straight, face carefully neutral. She sat across the table from him, hands folded in her lap, gray eyes watching him with an expression he could not quite read. Wariness, maybe, or curiosity pretending to be indifference. "Good morning," Jimmy said slowly, carefully enunciating each word. "Gut morning," Greta repeated, her accent thick, turning the vowels into something between English and German. Jimmy smiled despite himself. "Close, good, like hood, good. Good morning. Almost, good, the vowel is shorter. Good morning. Good morning." She got it that time, and something like pride flickered across her face. Brief, quickly hidden, but Jimmy caught it. They worked through basic phrases. "Hello. Thank you. Please. Excuse me." Greta was a fast learner, her mind sharp, grasping patterns quickly. But her pronunciation was a struggle, her tongue trained by decades of German sounds, resisting the new shapes English required. Jimmy was patient. He repeated words without frustration, found different ways to explain when she got stuck. At one point, they both reached for the same pencil on the table. Their hands touched. The contact lasted maybe half a second. Skin on skin, warm and electric, and completely inappropriate. Both of them froze. Both pulled back as if burned. Jimmy's ears turned bright red. Greta's heart started racing, and she hated herself for noticing, for caring, for feeling anything at all about an accidental touch. "Sorry, ma'am," Jimmy said, his voice rough. "Entschuldigung," Greta responded automatically, then caught herself. "Sorry, same, sorry." "What's that word mean? The German one?" "Sorry is same. Apology." "Schul?" He could not get his mouth around it. Greta almost smiled at his attempt. Almost. Neither of them knew that in 3 months they would be having much longer conversations in a place neither expected about a future neither dared to dream. The lesson continued, both of them hyper-aware of the space between them, now careful not to let their hands get close again. When the hour ended, Greta stood quickly, mumbled a thank you in careful English, and left before Jimmy could respond. He sat alone in the rec room for a long time after staring at the pencil they had both touched, wondering why his heart would not slow down. 3 days later, Colonel Hayes conducted his monthly inspection of camp facilities. This was standard procedure required by regulations, but Hayes took it more seriously than most commanders would have. He believed that the difference between a good camp and a bad one was in the details. The small things that showed whether you actually cared about the people under your authority or just went through the motions. Sergeant Bill Crawford accompanied him, clipboard in hand, taking notes. Crawford was 34, a WWI veteran who had seen his own share of horrors in French trenches. He respected Hayes, understood what the colonel was trying to accomplish here. They started in the kitchens. Hayes tasted from the same pot the prisoners would eat from. Beef stew today, thick with vegetables and actual chunks of meat. He nodded approval, asked Corporal Washington if he had adequate supplies. Washington said, "Yes, sir, plenty of everything, no complaints." Next were the barracks. Hayes entered the women's quarters, hat under his arm, respectful of their space, even though he had every right to inspect. He asked if the bedding was adequate, if the roof leaked, if they had enough blankets for cold nights. The women answered tentatively, surprised to be asked anything at all. Frida Braun, the oldest and boldest, spoke up. "We are treated well, Colonel, better than we expected." Hayes nodded. "That's the standard here. No less than what the Geneva Convention requires, but also no less than basic human decency demands." He checked the medical supplies next, made sure the women had proper hygiene items, that their specific needs were being met. This embarrassed some of the guards who accompanied him, but Hayes was matter-of-fact about it. Women needed different things than men. Ignoring that fact did not make it go away. Then came the work areas. Hayes watched the women at their tasks, making sure they were not being overworked, that conditions were safe. He saw Greta at the laundry tubs, hands red from hot water, and made a note to have rubber gloves provided. Finally, he gathered the guards in the yard. Greta was close enough to overhear, pretending to hang laundry while actually listening to every word. "Gentlemen," Hayes said, his voice carrying authority without needing to shout, "these people are under our protection, not our boot. The war is won. How we treat them now will determine how the world sees America for generations. We will give them dignity, proper care, and respect. Is that clear?" A chorus of yes, sirs. The men knew Hayes meant every word. He was not a man who made empty speeches. Greta stood frozen, a wet sheet in her hands, water dripping onto the dirt. Protection, dignity, respect. No German officer had ever spoken about enemy prisoners this way. The Wehrmacht talked about duty, about orders, about military necessity, never about protection, never about dignity for the conquered. Her entire worldview trembled. If Americans were not the barbarians propaganda claimed, if the war was not fought for the reasons she had been told, then what did that mean? Who had she been fighting for? What had her sister died for? The questions were dangerous, terrifying. She pushed them down, but they would not stay buried. They kept rising, demanding answers she did not have. In February 1944, Greta had attended a propaganda rally with her sister Anna. Required attendance for all medical personnel. The speaker had been passionate, fervent, filled with righteous fury. He had shouted about American cruelty, about how they bombed civilians because they hated civilization itself, because they were jealous of German culture and achievement. 16-year-old Anna had believed every word, had gone home fired up, ready to do her part for the fatherland. Greta had been more skeptical, but she had kept her doubts to herself. Doubt was dangerous in the Third Reich. People who doubted too loudly tended to disappear. Now standing in a Texas prison camp, watching an American colonel talk about dignity and protection, Greta realized how thoroughly she had been lied to. The anger that rose in her throat was not directed at Americans. It was directed at the men who had fed her those lies. The men who had sent her sister to die for a cause built on hatred and deception. This moment of doubt would lead Greta to ask a question 3 weeks later. A question so dangerous it would get her isolated in solitary confinement. But the answer would set her free in ways she never imagined. The women gathered in their barracks that evening, whispering conversations that grew bolder each night. They talked about the guards now, not with mockery, but with genuine curiosity. Did you see how the tall one smiled when I said good morning? Did you notice the young one with the harmonica always plays sad songs? Why do they treat us so kindly? Elsa Schneider, bold and direct, as always, turned to Greta with knowing eyes. Du magst ihn. You like him. Nein, das ist verrückt. Greta's denial was too fast, too vehement. No, that is crazy. Ich sehe wie du ihn ansiehst. I see how you look at him. Greta wanted to protest more, to build higher walls of denial, but the truth was there, undeniable in her racing heart every time Jimmy walked past. In the way she had memorized the exact shade of blue in his eyes, in how she found excuses to be in places where he might be. Ich mag Tom, Elsa said softly. I like Tom. Den Grossen mit braunen Augen, the tall one with brown eyes. The admission hung in the air between them. Both women stared at each other, horrified and relieved in equal measure. Horrified that they had allowed themselves to feel attraction to the enemy. Relieved that they were not alone in this impossible situation. Anna Klein's voice came from her bunk, barely above a whisper. Ich träume von Danny, der mit der Harmonika. I dream of Danny, the one with the harmonica. Silence fell over the barracks. Every woman realized in that moment that they were all fighting the same battle. Attraction to men they should hate. Longing for kindness they did not deserve. The terrible, wonderful possibility that barbed wire and propaganda could not stop human hearts from wanting what they wanted. Frida, the oldest, finally spoke. Was Maschenwehr, what do we do? No one had an answer. What could they do? They were prisoners. The men were guards. Regulations forbade fraternization. Even if the feelings were mutual and they had no way of knowing if they were, there was no path forward. No future where this ended in anything but heartbreak. What they decided to do would lead to the boldest act in the camp's history, an act so shocking it would reach the desk of General Eisenhower himself. But that was still 6 weeks away. The next morning, Greta was assigned to clean the guards' rec room. She entered with her bucket and rags ready to scrub floors and wipe down tables. The room was empty, most guards out on patrol or at their posts. On the windowsill she saw it, a single wildflower. Texas bluebonnet petals, the exact shade of the sky on a perfect day. It sat in an old tin can filled with water, clearly fresh picked that morning. Beside it, a note in clumsy handwriting. For the German lady who likes yellow flowers. J. Greta's hands began to shake. She looked around frantically, making sure she was truly alone. Then she picked up the note, read it again, and felt something crack open in her chest. She had mentioned her favorite color exactly once, last week during an English lesson. Jimmy had asked her to name colors in English: yellow, blue, red, green. When she said yellow, he had asked why. She had told him in broken English that yellow was sunshine, was hope, was her sister's favorite dress. He had written it in his notebook. She had seen him do it, but she had not thought anything of it at the time. Guards took notes during lessons. That was normal. But this meant he had remembered, had thought about it, had gone out into the desert, found a flower, brought it back for her. No reason except kindness, no expectation of anything in return. Greta remembered her father bringing her flowers after bad days at the school, age 8, struggling with mathematics, coming home in tears. Her father presenting her with a handful of daisies from the park, saying that numbers did not matter as much as her smile. She remembered being 16, her first school dance, a boy giving her roses that she pressed between book pages for years. This was the first flower anyone had given her in 4 years. 4 years of war and death and ash. And it came from an enemy guard who somehow knew that yellow meant sunshine to her. She picked up the flower, brought it to her nose. The scent was delicate sweet, carrying the smell of desert earth and wild growing things. She closed her eyes, allowed herself one moment of pure joy, uncomplicated by guilt or duty or fear. Then panic set in. What if they thought she had encouraged this? What if Jimmy expected something in return? What if this was manipulation, a way to gain her trust for some ulterior purpose? But looking at the simple flower in the simple, she could not make herself believe any of that. This was just kindness, pure, uncomplicated kindness from a young man who had seen something sad in her eyes and wanted to make it better. She hid the flower in her apron, finished cleaning the rec room in a daze, and carried it back to the barracks tucked against her ribs like contraband. That night, she pressed it carefully between the pages of her hidden journal, where it would stay for 40 years, a bookmark to the day her heart began to betray her training. Now I want you to imagine something. You are a young woman who has lost everything. Family, home, country. The people you were taught to hate show you more kindness than your own side ever did. What would you do? Would you hold on to hatred, or would you risk opening your heart? Share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever had to reconsider everything you believed about an enemy or opponent? How did it feel? The wildflower stayed pressed in Greta's journal for 40 years. But before it could become a treasured memory, it would first become evidence in a military investigation that threatened to tear the entire camp apart. April turned to May. The desert heat intensified. Work continued. English lessons continued. And with every passing day, the space between guards and prisoners grew smaller, the line between duty and desire blurring in ways that made everyone uncomfortable. Jimmy left extra bread on Greta's tray at meals. Not obviously just a subtle addition that she always noticed. Their eye contact during roll call lasted longer. 2 seconds, 3 seconds, 5 seconds. Entire conversations happening in silence, saying things neither dared speak aloud. Elsa commented on it. He looks at you differently. Other women noticed too. Some were jealous, some were curious. Some warned that hoping was dangerous, that nothing good could come from wanting what could not be had. But the warnings came too late. The seeds were already planted. Hearts had already begun their betrayal. Jimmy struggled with his own demons. He sat in his bunk at night writing letters home to his mother in Fredericksburg. He described camp life, the weather, the food. Mentioned the German prisoners in vague terms. Women, mostly nurses and clerks, not dangerous, just tired and lost. He wrote one letter that he never sent. The words poured out in a rush of honesty he could not contain. There is one who helps in the rec room. She is real quiet but smart, learning English quick. She lost her whole family in the bombings. Mama, when I look at her, I do not see an enemy. I see someone who needs help. Then he wrote the truth that terrified him. I think I am falling in love with her. He crossed it out, crumpled the paper, started over with safer words. But the truth remained undeniable in his chest every time he saw her. He was falling for a German prisoner, and there was not a damn thing he could do about it without risking his career, his reputation, maybe even court-martial. Jimmy's mother would eventually read about Greta in the newspapers, but not the way he imagined. The headlines would shock the entire state of Texas. May 8, 1945, 6 o'clock in the morning. The radio in the mess hall crackled to life with an announcement that would change everything. This is NBC. We interrupt this program for a special announcement. Germany has surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe is over. I repeat, the war in Europe is over. The American guards erupted. Cheers so loud they shook the walls, hats thrown in the air. Men hugging each other, some weeping openly, all of them releasing the tension of years spent wondering if they would be sent overseas, if they would die in some foreign field. The German women sat in stunned silence, complex emotions washing over faces that had learned to hide feeling. Relief that the killing was over. Grief that their country had been defeated. Fear about what came next. And underneath it all, a question that none of them wanted to voice. What happens to us now? Greta felt numb. Berlin was rubble. Her family was dead. Home did not exist anymore. If they sent her back to Germany, back to what bombed-out buildings and starvation, occupation by foreign armies, a country that would blame women like her for not doing more for surviving when so many had died, she looked across the mess hall and found Jimmy. He was celebrating with the other guards, genuine joy on his face. Then he caught her eye. His smile faded. He saw her tears, understood that these were not tears of relief or happiness. He understood that for her, the end of the war meant the beginning of a different kind of uncertainty. Their eyes locked. The noise of the mess hall faded. In that moment, there was just the two of them connected by something neither could name, but both could feel. The war between their nations was over. But the war between duty and desire was just beginning. That afternoon, Colonel Hayes called all the prisoners together in the yard. The women assembled, nervous, whispering among themselves about what this might mean. Hayes stood before them, hat in hand, face serious, but not unkind. Ladies, as you have heard, the war is over. Germany has surrendered. You are no longer enemy combatants. You are displaced persons awaiting repatriation. The women looked at each other. Repatriation. Being sent back. Back to nothing. Hayes continued. Within 4 to 6 weeks, transport ships will take you back to Germany. You will be processed through Ellis Island, then sent home. The United States government will provide documentation and basic supplies. He paused. The silence stretched. Then he said the words that would change everything. Or, every head came up, every eye focused on him. The United States offers asylum to those who wish to remain. You would need American sponsorship, a job housing someone willing to vouch for you. It is not an easy path, but it is a path. He looked directly at them, letting the weight of the choice settle. Think carefully about what you want. You have 4 weeks to decide. The bombshell had been dropped. The women stood in shock, minds racing. They could stay. There was a way to stay. But how? Who would sponsor them? What American would vouch for a German woman? Elsa spoke immediately, a voice fierce with determination. I am staying. Germany has nothing for me. Anna, more timid, asked the practical question. But how? Who would sponsor us? Frida, ever the realist, pointed out the obvious. We have no money, no skills Americans want, no connections. Greta stood silent, her heart a war zone. Could she stay? Would Jimmy sponsor her? Did he feel the same impossible pull she felt? Or was she projecting her own desperate loneliness onto a kind man who was just doing his job? The decision seemed impossible. But what none of the women knew was that 5 American guards had already made their own decision, and they were about to do something that would scandalize the entire camp. 2 days later, Elsa Schneider made her choice. She stole a piece of paper from the kitchen, sat on her bunk, and wrote in careful broken English. Dear Tom, moreover, I go Germany or stay America. I want stay. If you want to, I marry you. I am good wife. I cook. I clean. I work hard. You think about Elsa. She folded the note, hands shaking hard, pounding so hard she felt dizzy. This was insane, bold beyond reason. But Elsa had never been one to sit and wait for life to happen to her. If there was a chance, even a small one, she would take it. She waited for Tom's evening patrol. When he walked past the fence near the barracks, she approached quickly, heart in her throat. She held out the note. Tom took it confused, opened it, read the words written there in Elsa's careful handwriting. His face went white. He looked at her, then at the note, then back at her. For a moment, Elsa thought he might say yes right there. Thought she saw something in his eyes that matched what was in her heart. Then he crumpled the note, turned, walked away fast. Elsa watched him go, her heart shattering into pieces so small she did not know if they could ever be put back together. She ran to the barracks, threw herself on her bunk, and sobbed into her pillow. Great wrenching sobs that shook her whole body. The other women gathered around. Greta held her while she cried, asked what happened. Elsa told them between gasps, voice breaking with humiliation and grief. She had been so stupid, so foolish. Of course he did not want her. Why would any American man want a German prisoner? But 30 minutes later came a knock on the barracks door. Sergeant Crawford stood there, face serious. Elsa Schneider, Colonel Hayes wants to see you now. Terror flooded through Elsa. This was it. She was going to be punished, maybe deported immediately, maybe sent to solitary. She had broken some rules she did not know existed. She followed Crawford to Hayes's office on legs that barely held her. Inside, the colonel sat behind his desk. Tom stood at attention, face unreadable. And there on the desk between them was the crumpled note. Elsa thought she might vomit. Hayes spoke, voice calm and measured. Miss Schneider, Private Anderson brought this to my attention because he needed guidance on proper protocol. He paused, letting the words sink in. I want you to understand something. Romantic fraternization between guards and prisoners is complicated. It cannot happen while you are officially a POW. The regulations are clear. Elsa's heart sank. She had known it was impossible, had known and hoped anyway, and now she was paying the price for that hope. However, she looked up. In 6 days, your POW status officially ends. You will be classified as displaced persons seeking asylum. At that point, you are free citizens who can interact with anyone you choose. Hayes turned to Tom. Private Anderson, if you wish to pursue a relationship with Miss Schneider after her status changes, that is your personal business, not military business. Clear? Yes, sir. Tom's voice was steady, but Elsa could hear something underneath it, something that sounded like hope. Hayes looked back at Elsa. Miss Schneider, Private Anderson asked me to tell you something. He did not reject your proposal. He delayed his answer until it was legally and morally appropriate to say yes. He is saying yes. The world stopped. Elsa's brain could not process the words. Rejected became delayed. No became yes. Impossible became, maybe became, potentially became real. Tom stepped forward. I could not say yes while you were a prisoner, Elsa. Would not be right, but when you are free, I would be honored. Elsa broke. Happy tears this time, relief and joy and disbelief flooding through her all at once. She covered her face with her hands, shoulders shaking, unable to speak. Tom wanted to go to her to hold her, but Hayes was still there, so he stayed where he was. But his eyes said everything his position would not allow him to do. Within 24 hours, every woman in the camp knew what had happened, and 5 more marriage proposals were written, including one that would take 40 years to fully understand. The news of Elsa's proposal and Tom's answer spread through the camp like wildfire through dry grass. By evening, every woman knew. By morning, every guard knew. And in the space between knowing and doing, something shifted. The impossible suddenly seemed possible. The forbidden suddenly had a path forward. Anna Klein was the second to write a letter. She sat on her bunk for 2 hours, pencil trembling in her hand, trying to find words in a language she barely spoke, to express feelings she barely understood. Finally, she wrote simply, I dream of you when harmonica plays. I want to stay America. You want me to stay. She gave the note to Danny Hayes during an English lesson, her face burning red, unable to meet his eyes. Danny opened it right there, read it twice, then looked at her with an expression so tender it made her want to cry. Yes, he said, just that one word, but it contained everything. Yes, I want you to stay. Yes, I dream of you too. Yes, this crazy, impossible thing might actually work. Anna did cry then. Happy tears that she tried to hide behind her hands while Danny sat frozen, wanting desperately to comfort her, but knowing he could not yet not, while regulations still bound them to their separate sides of an invisible line. Frida Braun, 31 years old and practical to her bones, wrote to Sergeant Bill Crawford. She did not mince words or play coy. I am old, but I am strong. I will be good partner. What you think, Crawford, 34 and scarred by his own war, wrote back within an hour. Age is just a number. Character is forever. Let's talk. They talked. Long conversations in the rec room with a table between them, getting to know each other in a way that people rarely did before marriage in those days. They talked about the first war, about what they had seen, about the nightmares that still woke them in the dark. 2 veterans finding understanding in the last place either expected. Now you might wonder, was this common? Actually, yes. Between 1945 and 1946, over 800 German POW women married American guards across camps in the United States. The Army tried to discourage it, issued memos and warnings and threats, but they could not stop human hearts from finding connection in the aftermath of war. Love, it turned out, was the one enemy that regulations could not defeat. 4 more women wrote letters. 4 more guards said yes. The camp was transforming from a place of confinement into a place of courtship, and Colonel Hayes watched it all with a mixture of concern and quiet approval. He knew this would bring scrutiny, knew there would be questions from higher up, but he also knew that what was happening here was proof of something important, proof that American values properly applied could turn enemies into family. Greta did not write a letter. She was too afraid, too uncertain. She watched the other women find their courage and felt like a coward for not finding her own. But the truth was, she did not know what Jimmy felt. The wildflower could have meant anything. The extra bread could have been kindness without deeper feeling. She could not bear to put her heart on paper only to have it returned crumpled and rejected. So she waited and hoped and tried not to let hope show on her face. Jimmy was fighting his own battle. He wanted to approach Greta directly to tell her what he felt, but he did not know if his feelings were welcome. She was polite during English lessons, but polite could mean anything. She never looked at him the way Elsa looked at Tom, with open longing. Greta's feelings, if she had any, were locked behind walls he did not know how to breach. He lay awake at night in his bunk, thinking about the proper thing to do. A gentleman did not push his attentions on a woman, especially a woman in a vulnerable position. But if he did not speak, if he let her go back to Germany without saying anything, he would regret it for the rest of his life. Finally, he made his decision. He would talk to her, directly, honestly. Give her the choice without pressure, then respect whatever answer she gave. He found her in the laundry yard 3 days after Elsa's proposal. She was hanging sheets, and the white fabric billowed in the desert breeze like sails. They were alone. First time truly alone since they had met 2 months ago. "Greta," he said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended. "I need to talk to you." She turned eyes wide, a clothespin in her hand. "Yes," Jimmy took a breath. He had rehearsed this, but all his careful words fled. "I heard about the others, the proposals." Greta's face went carefully neutral. "Yes, I heard too. I wanted to talk to you directly, not write a letter. This feels like something that should be said face to face." Her heart was pounding so hard she thought he must be able to hear it. "Okay." "I cannot write pretty words like Tom did," Jimmy said, and now the words were coming in a rush. "I am just a ranch hand who got drafted, but I can tell you this. I think about you every morning when I wake up. I think about you every night before I sleep." Greta's breath caught. The clothespin fell from her fingers. "I know we barely know each other," Jimmy continued. "I know this is fast. I know your life has been hell, and mine has been easy in comparison. But I also know that when I look at you, I see someone brave and strong and worthy of every good thing life can offer." He took another breath, steadying himself. "I am asking you to take a chance on a simple Texas cowboy. Come to my family's ranch. Learn to ride horse. Learn to love mesquite barbecue. Learn to love me, maybe, if you want." Greta stood, frozen tears streaming down her face. All the walls she had built, all the careful control crumbling under the weight of his honesty. "Why?" The word came out broken. "Why you want me, I am enemy. I believe terrible things about you, about America." "Because I think you have learned the truth," Jimmy said gently. "And because hate is taught, but kindness is chosen. You have been choosing kindness for weeks now. I see it." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the pressed wildflower, the one she thought was hidden in her journal. Her eyes went wide. "You kept it," he said. "That tells me everything I need to know." "How did you—" She could not finish the question. "I did not go through your things," he said quickly. "It fell out when you dropped your journal during a lesson last week. I picked it up for you, saw the flower pressed inside. I did not mean to pry." Greta touched her face, wiping at tears. "I have nothing. No family, no money, no home. I am nothing." Jimmy stepped closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of gray in Heflon eyes, close enough to smell soap and desert sun on his skin. "You are not nothing. You are Greta Weber, who survived Berlin bombings, who learned English in 3 weeks, who helps the other women when they cry, who sneaks food to the stray dog behind the barracks, even though you barely eat it enough yourself." Greta's eyes widened. "You saw that," Jimmy smiled. "I see everything about you." The moment stretched between them, heavy with possibility. This was the decision point, the moment that would determine everything that came after. Greta could say no, could go back to Germany, could try to rebuild some kind of life in the ruins of her homeland. It would be safe, expected, the path of least resistance. Or she could say yes, could trust this freckled cowboy with the gentle eyes, could take the terrifying leap into an unknown future in a foreign country with a man she barely knew, but somehow felt she had been waiting for all her life. "Yes," she whispered, "I will come to ranch. I will try to love you. I think maybe I already do." They did not kiss. That would have been improper, could have gotten Jimmy in trouble. But their hands found each other's fingers, intertwining, holding tight. And in that touch was a promise, a commitment, the beginning of something that would last longer than either of them could imagine. 1 week later, Jimmy drove Greta out to the Morrison Ranch, 40 miles from Fort Stockton, through landscape that looked like the end of the world. Endless sky cattle grazing on sparse grass, mesquite trees twisted by wind into shapes that looked almost alive. Greta sat in the passenger seat of his truck, watching Texas roll past, feeling something she had not felt in years. Freedom. Not legal freedom yet, her status was still being processed, but the freedom that came from choosing, from having agency over her own life again. The ranch appeared on the horizon, low house barn corrals, simple but solid, the kind of place built by people who valued function over flash. Jimmy pulled up in front of the house, and Greta saw a woman standing on the porch, gray hair in a bun, flour dusting her apron, stern face that softened slightly when she saw Greta's nervous expression. Margaret Morrison, 50 years old, had raised 3 sons on this ranch, had buried one in infancy, sent another off to war. She knew hardship, knew loss, and she knew her remaining son well enough to see that this girl meant something to him. "So you are the girl my son will not stop writing about," Margaret said, as Greta climbed out of the truck. "Yes, ma'am, I am Greta." Her English was better now, but the accent would never fully leave. "Can you cook?" "A little, ma'am." "Can you ride a horse?" "No, ma'am." "Can you wake up at 5 in the morning and work until sundown?" "Yes, ma'am, I can work very hard." Margaret stared at her for a long moment. Greta felt like she was being examined down to her soul. Then Margaret's face softened fully and she nodded. "Good, because ranch life is not easy. But if you are willing to learn, I am willing to teach. Come inside. I made pot roast." She turned to Jimmy. "She is thin as a rail. Feed her." The house smelled like home. Not Greta's home, she had no home anymore. But the idea of home. The promise of it. Pot roast in the oven, fresh bread cooling on the counter, coffee percolating on the stove. Margaret led Greta to the table, set a plate in front of her that held more food than she had seen on one plate since before the war. Jimmy's father, Robert Morrison, 52 years old, with sun-weathered skin and kind eyes, said grace. "Lord, thank you for this food, this family, and for bringing this young lady to our table. Help her find peace here. Amen." He included her in family, just like that. No hesitation. Greta started crying into her mashed potatoes, overwhelmed by the simple acceptance. "Honey, what is wrong?" Margaret's voice was gentle now, maternal. "Is too much kind." Greta managed through tears. "I do not deserve." Robert reached across the table and patted her hand. "Everyone deserves kindness, miss, especially those who have seen too much cruelty. I would love to hear from you. If you have ever experienced unexpected kindness from someone you thought was your enemy, or if you have been the one to extend that kindness, share your story below. These moments of human connection are what make history worth remembering. August 15th, 1945. Victory over Japan Day. The Second War was finally completely over. And on that day of global celebration, 7 weddings took place in the small Baptist church in Fort Stockton, Texas. Elsa and Tom were first. Elsa in a borrowed white dress that was too big in the waist but perfect everywhere else. Tom in his dress uniform, standing straighter than he ever had, eyes wet as he watched her walk down the aisle. Colonel Hayes walked her down that aisle, standing in for the father she no longer had. When the minister said, "You may kiss the bride," Tom pulled Elsa close and kissed her like the war had just ended, which in a way it had. Anna and Danny were next. Danny played harmonica as she walked toward him, a German hymn she had taught him. Anna wept happy tears all the way to the altar. Their vows were exchanged in both German and English, a blending of 2 languages, 2 cultures, 2 lives becoming one. Frida and Sergeant Crawford stood together, both of them older than most newlyweds, both of them scarred by war, both of them finding in each other a peace they had thought was lost forever. When Crawford slipped the ring on her finger, Frida's hand shook. Not from fear, from the overwhelming realization that she got to start over, that life was giving her a second chance. 4 more couples married that day, each with their own story, their own journey from enemy to beloved. But the last wedding saved for the end was Greta and Jimmy. Greta wore a simple white dress that Margaret had altered to fit. The wildflower, carefully preserved, was tucked into her hair. She carried no bouquet, just her sister's locket around her neck, the only piece of her old life she was bringing into the new. Colonel Hayes walked her down the aisle for the second time that day. As they moved toward where Jimmy waited, Hayes leaned close and whispered, "Your mother would be proud." Greta's tears started then and did not stop. Tears for her mother who would never see this. For her sister who should have been her maid of honor. For the father she would never find. But also tears of gratitude that she had survived to reach this moment. That she got to choose joy after so much sorrow. Jimmy stood at the altar watching her approach, and his own eyes were wet. He had never seen anything more beautiful than this woman who had chosen to trust him with her broken heart and uncertain future. The vows were spoken in English. Greta had practiced for weeks. I come to you with nothing but broken past. You give me future full of hope. I promise to love you, to work beside you, to build new life with you. You teach me America is not place, is idea. Idea of kindness. I will honor that always. Jimmy's voice was steady despite his tears. I promise to protect you, to provide for you, to help you heal. You have taught me that enemies are just people who have not met yet. I will love you until the day I die. They kissed, their first kiss, and it felt like coming home. The reception was held at the Morrison Ranch. Long tables set up under the Texas sky, laden with food that represented two cultures coming together. Texas, barbecue, brisket, smoked for 14 hours. Greta's first attempt at cornbread, guided by Margaret's patient instruction. German potato salad made from a recipe Frida's grandmother had passed down. Fusion before anyone called it that. Danny played his harmonica. Someone produced a guitar. Music filled the air, country songs and German folk tunes dancing under stars so bright they looked close enough to touch. Greta tried to two-step, laughing at her own clumsiness, held secure in Jimmy's arms as he guided her through the steps. You will get better, he promised. We have forever to practice. Forever. The word felt like a gift. The years passed in the way years do, each one adding layers to the foundation they were building. 1947 brought their daughter Sarah, named for Greta's lost sister, Anna's middle name. Greta held the baby and wept, overwhelmed by the miracle of creating life after witnessing so much death. In 1952, Greta became a United States citizen. She stood in a courtroom in Austin, raised her right hand, and spoke the oath of allegiance in English that was now fluent, though still accented. I hereby declare on oath that I absolutely and entirely renounce and abjure all allegiance and fidelity to any foreign prince, potentate, state, or sovereignty. When she said those words, she meant them. Germany was her past. America was her future. The proudest day of her life, she told Jimmy that night. More than her wedding, more than Sarah's birth, because this was her choice, her declaration that she belonged here. By 1953, they had 3 children, Sarah, Robert, and James Jr. The ranch prospered. Greta learned to ride horses, learned to rope cattle, learned to be a ranch wife in ways that surprised everyone, including herself. She taught her children German, wanted them to know where half their heritage came from. But she raised them American with American values, American dreams. When Robert enlisted for Vietnam in 1968, Greta's heart broke, but she understood. This country gave me life, she told Jimmy through tears. Now my son serves it, is right. The grandchildren started arriving in 1975. Sarah's daughter, born in the same bedroom where Sarah herself had been born. Greta held the baby and whispered in German, Deine Urgroßmutter würde dich lieben. Your great-grandmother would have loved you. Then in English, you will never know war. That is gift. Through it all, through decades of life on the ranch, Greta never took off her sister's locket, and she never forgot where she came from, what she had survived, or how close she had come to missing all of this. In 1980, Jimmy had a heart attack. Survived it, but it scared them both. Reminded them that time was finite, that the years they had been given were not infinite. Greta refused to leave his hospital bedside. When nurses told her to go home and rest, she said firmly, I waited 40 years to be with him. I do not waste 1 minute. August 1985. A letter arrived at the Morrison Ranch. Greta, now 64, opened it with hands that showed the work of 40 years. The letter was from Colonel Hayes, now 85 and long retired. Dear Greta and Jimmy, Fort Stockton is dedicating the old POW camp as a historical site. They are honoring the unique story of the camp where former enemies became family. They want us all there, all the couples. August 15th, 1985. 40 years to the day. Will you come? Greta looked at Jimmy. 62 now, hair more gray than blonde, but eyes still the same blue. Should we go? I think we should, Jimmy said. Show them what became of us. The drive back to Fort Stockton was like traveling through time. Same roads, same landscape, but everything different. They were different. No longer young prisoners and guards, but elderly couple with a lifetime of shared memories. The camp had been preserved as a memorial site. Barracks still stood weathered but intact. The barbed wire was still there, rusted now, surrounded by wildflowers that had taken over where desert used to be. Greta walked into her old barracks, found the bunk where she had slept all those nights, touched the rough wood wall, saw the window where the wildflower had sat that first morning. Memory flooded back so vividly she could almost smell the mesquite smoke, almost hear the harmonica playing. Jimmy found her there, put his arms around her from behind. She leaned into him, feeling the solidity of 40 years of love. "I was so scared that first day," she said softly. "Me too. Scared you would reject me. Never, from moment you gave me flower." Outside reunions were happening everywhere. Elsa and Tom, now 68 and 65, surrounded by their 4 children and 9 grandchildren. Elsa looked at Tom and laughed. "Remember when you crumpled my note I wanted to D? Best decision I ever made was asking the colonel for advice first," Tom said, pulling her close. Anna and Danny stood by the fence, Danny's hair white now, but still holding his harmonica. He played the same tune he had played in 1945, and Anna still cried, happy tears listening to it. The mayor of Fort Stockton stood at a podium for the dedication ceremony. "This camp represents something unique in American history, a place where the principles we fought for, dignity, freedom, human kindness, were practiced even toward those we defeated. 7 marriages came from this place, 43 children, 128 grandchildren, as all Americans, and all because a few people chose love over hate." They unveiled a memorial plaque, bronze gleaming in the afternoon sun. "Fort Stockton POW Camp 1943 to 1945, where wire separated enemies and kindness united hearts. Dedicated to the 7 couples who proved that love knows no borders." The names of all 7 couples were listed. Greta and Jimmy's names were first. Later, Greta stood alone at the old fence line. The barbed wire was still there, rusted and covered in flowering vines now. She removed her sister's locket, held it in her palm. Opened it. Anna's face faded but still visible after 40 years. Her granddaughter Sarah approached. 18 years old, named for Greta's daughter, who had been named for Greta's sister. 3 generations connected by names and love. "Oma, who is that?" Sarah asked, looking at the photo. "My little sister. She died in war. She was 16, same age as you." Sarah's face filled with sympathy. "I'm sorry, Oma." "Do not be sorry, Liebling. Be grateful. She died so you could live in peace. Your grandfather gave me that peace. America gave me that peace." Greta looked at the memorial at the camp, at the families gathered there. 7 couples, 43 children, 128 grandchildren. All of them living proof that kindness could overcome hatred, that love could bridge any divide. "The Americans could have been cruel," Greta said to her granddaughter. "Geneva Convention said they must feed us, house us, that is all. But they chose more. They chose kindness, and kindness saved my soul." Jimmy came to stand beside her, put his arm around her shoulders. Greta unfastened the locket from her own neck, placed it around Sarah's. "You keep this. Remember her. Remember that hate destroys, but love builds families that last forever." All 7 couples gathered for a photograph. Elderly now, bodies marked by time, but still holding hands. Still together. Elsa and Tom, Anna and Danny, Frida and Crawford. 4 other couples whose names are recorded on that memorial. And in the center, Greta and Jimmy Morrison. The photographer said, "On 3, everyone say America." They did. The word came out in accents German and Texan and everything in between. But it meant the same thing to all of them. Home, hope, second chances. That photograph hangs in the Fort Stockton Memorial today. 7 couples, 43 children, 128 grandchildren. All because of bacon wildflowers and young people brave enough to choose love. Greta Weber's story is not unique. It is repeated throughout history. Former enemies becoming friends, lovers, family. But what makes it powerful is what it teaches us about the values that built America. The real values, not the ones we just talk about, but the ones we practice when nobody's looking. Dignity over dominance. The guards at Fort Stockton could have treated prisoners poorly and still followed Geneva Convention minimum requirements. Instead, they chose excellence. Why? Because American values demand we treat all people with dignity, not because we have to, because it is right. Colonel Hayes inspecting food quality himself, Tom carrying Anna's bucket, Jimmy giving a wildflower to a woman he barely knew. These were not required actions. They were chosen actions. And that choice is what makes them meaningful. This is what separated America from the regimes we fought. They demanded obedience through fear. We inspired loyalty through respect. They ruled by force. We led by example. And when the war ended, that difference became visible in 1,000 small ways. In how we treated defeated enemies. In how we rebuilt rather than destroyed. In how we opened doors instead of building walls. Many of you watching lived through this era. Maybe you served, maybe your father did. Maybe you remember when POW camps were still operational across America. You are from the generation that fought the war, won the peace, and built the world we live in today. You understand sacrifice. You understand duty. You understand that how we treat others, even enemies, defines who we are. Greta Weber passed away in 2012, age 91. Jimmy followed 6 months later, age 89. They were married 67 years. At her funeral, 43 children and 128 grandchildren attended, all American citizens, all because one Texas cowboy chose kindness over cruelty, and all because one German nurse chose hope over hatred. What legacy are we leaving? Are we teaching the next generation that enemies are permanent, or that enemies are just people who have not found common ground? Yet Greta and Jimmy found that ground over a plate of bacon and a wildflower. Imagine what we could accomplish if we approached our differences with that same spirit. Fort Stockton. POW camp closed in 1946. The barracks are now a museum. The fence still stands, but the real monument is not made of wood and wire. It is made of families. Families built on the foundation of American kindness toward former enemies. 7 couples, 43 children, 128 grandchildren, over 200 great-grandchildren by now. All because some young Americans believed that winning the war was not enough. We had to win the peace too, and we did it the American way, with bacon, wildflowers, and open hearts. This is what makes America great. Not our weapons, not our wealth, our values. The belief that every person deserves dignity, even enemies, especially enemies. That is the legacy of Fort Stockton. That is the legacy of the greatest generation. That is America.